I still remember the day the clay tablet arrived from Ugarit in the spring of 1185 BCE. I was a junior scribe in the records house at Thebes when the courier brought it through. The tablet was smaller than usual, fired in haste, and the cuneiform marks looked uneven, pressed too hard. It said the harbor was burning. It said enemy ships filled the horizon. It said they needed grain, soldiers, anything Egypt could send. Then 3 words at the end: ships enemy fire. We sent a reply north within 2 days. Standard diplomatic language, promises of support, requests for more detail. The reply never came. A month passed, then 2. The seasonal grain shipment from Ugarit did not arrive. The Hittite correspondence, which came like clockwork every new moon, simply stopped. Portmasters in the Delta reported that Mycenaean trade vessels had not made their usual runs. We kept writing, we kept dispatching couriers along the coastal roads. Some came back and said the roads were empty. Some never came back at all. In the archives, I watched senior scribes grow quiet as they filed unanswered letters. They had spent their entire careers managing the flow of information between Egypt and the northern kingdoms. Trade manifests, diplomatic agreements, marriage negotiations, border disputes, an endless stream of tablets and papyrus that proved the world was stable, organized, predictable. Now the stream had stopped. One by one, the cities went silent. Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, Carchemish. No word from the Hittite capital at Hattusa, no messages from Cyprus. It was like watching lamps go out across a vast distance, each one winking into darkness while we stood in Thebes with our pens ready and nothing to record but absence. We did not understand yet. We thought it was disruption, temporary chaos, something that would restore itself. We did not know the world was ending. The first refugees arrived at the Delta border posts in the 8th year of Pharaoh Merneptah's reign. I was assigned to document their testimonies because I could read Akkadian and had some knowledge of Hittite administrative terms. I expected farmers, herders, the usual border crossers fleeing local conflicts. What I saw instead were men in fine robes with ink-stained fingers and women wearing jewelry that marked them as nobility. These were not peasants. I interviewed a Hittite provincial governor who had fled south with his entire household. He sat across from me in the processing tent with his hands shaking and described what happened to his city in northern Syria. He said ships appeared at dawn, hundreds of them moving in coordinated lines along the coast. By noon, the harbor was burning. By sunset, the administrative quarter had fallen. He did not stop to see what happened after dark. He took his family and ran. A Cypriot copper merchant told me similar things. He said the raiders moved faster than any military force he had ever seen. No prolonged siege, no negotiation. They simply landed, burned the warehouses, killed anyone who resisted, and moved on to the next port. He said he watched from the hills as his city died in less than a day. The details they provided made no sense according to what I knew of warfare. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, had walls thick enough to withstand any siege engine ever built. Yet refugees claimed it fell. Ugarit had a strong garrison and early warning systems. Yet the city burned so hot that mud bricks melted into glass. Troy had stood for 1,000 years through wars and earthquakes. Yet I spoke with a Greek-speaking sailor who said he saw the citadel in ruins, smoke still rising from the stones. Every refugee described the same pattern: ships without clear markings, warriors who spoke different languages but fought together, fires that consumed everything. And then, after the destruction, nothing. No occupation, no looting that made strategic sense. The attackers simply burned what they found and kept moving, as if they were not conquering territory but erasing it. I wrote everything down in careful hieratic script and filed the reports with the senior archivists. They read my documentation in silence. One of them, an old man who had served 3 pharaohs, looked up at me and said the Bronze Age was collapsing. I did not understand what he meant at the time. But the refugees kept coming, more every week. Ship captains, scribes, priests, merchants, administrators. The entire professional class of the northern world was fleeing south toward Egypt. And behind them, the great fortress cities of the Mediterranean were falling one by one into fire and silence. I was present in the audience hall when Pharaoh Merneptah received the dispatch from the Western Delta commanders in 1208 BCE. The message was brief and alarming. Foreign vessels had landed on the coast near Libya. Not a raid. An invasion force with women, children, livestock, and wagons. They were setting up camps. They intended to stay. The commander's description confused everyone in the room. He said the force included warriors from many different regions. Some wore armor styles similar to Anatolian designs. Others carried weapons that looked Aegean. A few groups spoke languages with Libyan roots. They did not fight under a single king or unified command structure. Instead, they moved as separate tribes with their own leaders, but coordinated their actions as if following a shared plan. Egyptian scribes began recording the names these groups called themselves. Shekelesh, Luka, Shurden, Peliset, Cheker, Weshesh. Each name belonged to a distinct people with their own dialect and customs. But our border officials could not determine where any of them originated. When questioned, some claimed to come from islands in the north. Others said they fled from burning cities in Anatolia. A few gave no answer at all. The senior scribe beside me grew frustrated with the lack of clarity. He finally wrote in the official record, "Peoples of the sea," because no single origin could be confirmed. The phrase stuck. In every subsequent document, that is what we called them. Not because it was accurate, but because it was all we knew. What disturbed me most was not their arrival, but their organization. These were not desperate refugees stumbling onto our shores. They came with siege equipment, bronze weapons, detailed knowledge of Egyptian coastal defenses. They brought their entire societies with them, families and livestock, as if they had planned this migration carefully. They moved with purpose. I spoke with a captured Shurden warrior after a skirmish near the border. He was tall, heavily scarred, and spoke broken Egyptian. I asked him why they came. He looked at me for a long moment and said something was broken in the north. The cities were dying. The trade had stopped. The fields would not yield. He said his people had 2 choices: move south toward Egypt or starve where they stood. I asked where his homeland was. He pointed north and said a word I did not recognize. I asked if he planned to return someday. He shook his head and said there was nothing left to return to. That answer frightened me more than any battle report. These were not conquerors seeking plunder. They were survivors fleeing something worse than war. And whatever had destroyed their world was pushing them directly toward ours. I was older when the Sea Peoples returned in force during the reign of Ramesses III. 25 years had passed since Merneptah's battles, and some in the palace had convinced themselves the threat had ended. They were wrong. The scouts came back from the Delta with reports that made the War Council fall silent. A fleet was approaching from the northeast, moving along the coast in organized columns. The numbers they gave seemed impossible. Hundreds of vessels, perhaps more than 1,000, cargo ships mixed with warships. Entire populations on the move again, but this time with a naval force larger than anything Egypt had ever faced. Ramesses III mobilized every available ship and called up the archer battalions from Upper Egypt. I accompanied the military scribes to the Delta to document what would happen at the mouth of the Nile. We arrived 3 days before the Sea People's fleet reached the Pelusiac branch. I stood on the eastern bank when their ships came into view. The water turned dark with the shadows of their hulls. They moved in tight formations, using the wind and oars together with practiced coordination. These were not raiders. This was an invasion force that had refined its methods over decades of migration and conquest. Ramesses had positioned our fleet at the narrowest channels where the river met the sea. Egyptian archers lined both shores in dense ranks, thousands of men with bows ready. Fire ships waited in concealed positions behind reed banks. The pharaoh himself stood on a command platform wearing full battle regalia visible to every soldier. When the sea peoples entered the narrows, our archers opened fire, the air filled with arrows, so many that the sky seemed to darken. The fire ships launched and rammed into their lead vessels. Flames spread across their decks. Men screamed and dove into the water. Our ships closed from both sides and crushed them in the channel. The battle lasted most of the day. The water turned red. Bodies floated downstream in such numbers that they clogged the irrigation channels for weeks. We captured hundreds of prisoners and drove the surviving ships back toward the open sea. Ramesses declared total victory. He ordered the battle carved into the temple walls at Medinet Habu in enormous relief scenes showing Egyptian triumph and enemy defeat. The carvings are magnificent. They show Pharaoh standing firm while foreign warriors fall in chaos. But I remember what the carvings do not show. Thousands of sea peoples survived and melted into the coastal territories. The Egyptian fleet was shattered and never fully rebuilt. Trade with the north did not resume. And Egypt, despite the victory, was exhausted in ways that would take generations to understand. In the 5th year after the Great Battle, Ramesses III commissioned a survey expedition to assess what remained of Egypt's former trading partners in the north. I was selected to accompany the mission because of my experience documenting refugee testimonies and my knowledge of foreign languages. We departed from the Delta with 3 ships, armed escorts, and enough supplies for 6 months of travel. Our first stop was the coast of Canaan, then we moved north toward Syria and Anatolia. What we found was not occupation or recovery. It was abandonment on a scale I had never imagined possible. Ugarit sat empty under the sun. The harbor had silted over from decades of neglect. The great palace stood partially collapsed, its walls cracked and leaning. We walked through silent streets where weeds grew between paving stones. In the scribal quarter, I found clay tablets still sitting on desks where they had been left mid-sentence. One tablet was a letter requesting military aid. The scribe never finished it. Ash covered everything in a thick gray layer. We sailed to Cyprus and found similar devastation. The copper smelting centers that had supplied the entire Mediterranean were cold and dark. The furnaces had not been lit in years. Storage buildings stood open with their contents scattered by wind and rain. When we reached the Anatolian coast and traveled inland toward Hattusa, I expected to find at least some remnant population. The Hittite Empire had ruled for centuries. Its capital had housed tens of thousands of people. We climbed the hill to the citadel and found the gates standing open. Inside, the streets were empty. No bodies, no signs of a final battle, just silence. The administrative buildings showed evidence of hurried preparation. Walls had been reinforced with rubble. Weapons had been stockpiled in temples. Someone had tried to defend this place, but there were no burn marks. No destruction layers like we saw in Ugarit. The population had simply left, as if they abandoned the capital of an empire and walked away into the hills. Our expedition leader stood in the throne room of the great king and said nothing for a long time. Dust moved in shafts of light through broken roof tiles. Bird nests filled the upper corners. The empire that had negotiated with Egypt as an equal power for 300 years was gone. We documented 12 major cities on that expedition. All showed the same pattern: destruction, abandonment, or both. The trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean world had simply ceased to function. In some places, we found small groups of survivors living in the ruins, but they could not tell us what happened. They had not been there when the cities fell. Not all the sea peoples vanished into legend. Some settled in the territories they had raided and became part of the landscape we now patrol. I have watched this transformation happen over the past 20 years, and it troubles me in ways I cannot fully articulate. The Peliset established themselves along the southern coast of Canaan in territory that had been under Egyptian control. They built 5 cities: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, Gaza, using foundations that were already there but adding their own styles. Their pottery in the early years was distinct, painted with patterns that looked Aegean. Their architecture included features I had seen in Mycenaean ruins. But within a single generation, those foreign elements began to fade. I traveled to Ashkelon on a diplomatic mission in the 15th year of Ramesses III's reign. The Peliset leaders I met spoke the local Canaanite dialect fluently. They wore local clothing. They worshipped local gods alongside their own. Their children could barely speak the language their grandparents had used. When I asked an elder where his people originated, he gave me a vague answer about islands in the north and then changed the subject. The Shurden, who had attacked Egypt in such numbers during Merneptah's reign, were now serving in our own army as elite mercenaries. I saw entire Shurden units in the Pharaoh's guard wearing Egyptian military dress and swearing oaths to Egyptian gods. The warriors who had once been our enemies now protected our king. They received land grants in the Delta and married Egyptian women. Their children were Egyptian. The Checker occupied the port city of Dor and became successful maritime traders. Within 2 generations, they stopped building the distinctive ships they had arrived in, and instead used local designs. They adopted local weights and measures for commerce. They kept records in Egyptian hieratic script rather than whatever writing system they had once known. What united all these settled groups was a profound forgetting. The sea peoples who had moved as a coordinated force across the Mediterranean, who had destroyed empires and reshaped the ancient world, simply stopped being sea peoples. They became Philistines, Egyptian mercenaries, Canaanite merchants. They intermarried with local populations. They abandoned whatever coherence had held them together during the migrations. It was as if the force that unified them, desperation, shared catastrophe, collective ambition, had burned itself out completely. The warriors who had toppled kingdoms became farmers who worried about harvest yields. The sailors who had commanded invasion fleets became shopkeepers who haggled over the price of oil. And not one of them ever wrote down where they came from, why they came, or what they were running from. Within 3 generations, the knowledge was gone. The priests and scholars in Thebes debated the origins of the sea peoples for the rest of my career in the archives, and I never heard 2 men agree completely. Every theory had evidence to support it, and every theory had gaps that could not be filled. The most common explanation was that the sea peoples were displaced Mycenaeans fleeing the collapse of their own kingdoms in Greece. Their pottery styles matched. Some of their weapon designs were identical to what we found in Mycenaean ruins. A Greek-speaking merchant I interviewed claimed he recognized tribal names among the sea peoples that corresponded to regions in the Aegean. But this theory could not explain the Anatolian groups, or why Mycenaean civilization would destroy itself so completely that its own people became refugees. Other scholars insisted the sea peoples were Anatolian populations fleeing the fall of the Hittite Empire. The timeline supported this. The Hittite collapse preceded the major sea peoples' invasions by only a few years. Several tribal names appeared in Hittite records as vassal states or border groups. But if they were Hittite subjects, why did they move with such coordinated military force? Why did they carry families and livestock like a planned migration rather than a panicked flight? A few priests proposed they came from beyond the known world entirely, northern barbarians from regions we had never contacted. This explained why we could not identify their homeland, but it did not explain their sophisticated naval tactics or their familiarity with Mediterranean trade routes and defensive systems. The theory that haunted me most came from an old scribe named Amenhotep, who worked in the foreign correspondence archives. He believed the sea peoples were not a single people at all, but a cascading wave of displacement. He said one group was pushed out by drought or invasion, and they displaced the next group, who displaced the next, in a chain reaction that spread across the entire Mediterranean. Each population became part of the wave, absorbing refugees and adding to the momentum until the distinction between invader and victim disappeared completely. Another explanation, whispered in the temples but never written in official records, suggested climate failure. Crop yields had declined across the north for decades before the migrations began. Some priests believed widespread famine triggered the collapse, and the sea peoples were simply everyone who refused to starve quietly in their ancestral lands. But we had no archives from their side, no captured libraries, no prisoners who could provide detailed histories. The sea peoples left no written records of their own origins, their motivations, their internal organization, or their ultimate goals. All we had were Egyptian accounts of battles, refugee testimonies fragmented by trauma and language barriers, and the physical evidence of destroyed cities that could not speak. I am an old man now, and Egypt is not what it was when I entered the scribal school as a boy. The changes happened slowly enough that most people did not notice, but I kept records. I know what we lost. The bronze trade networks never recovered. The routes that once brought tin from the Far East and copper from Cyprus simply stopped functioning. The great ports that had bustled with merchants from a dozen nations remain quiet. A few local traders still operate, but the vast organized system that fed empires for 3 centuries is gone. We now struggle to acquire enough bronze for basic tools and weapons. Literacy declined across the entire region the sea peoples touched. The scribal schools burned with the palaces that supported them. In Ugarit, in Hattusa, in Mycenae, in Troy, everywhere the migrations reached, the tradition of writing either died completely or shrank to a fraction of what it had been. Entire languages disappeared because there was no one left to teach them. Hittite cuneiform, once used for imperial correspondence across Anatolia, is now incomprehensible to anyone outside a small group of elderly Egyptian archivists. Mycenaean Greek, written in Linear B script, vanished so completely that even Greeks no longer recognize it. The palace economies that organized labor, distributed food, and maintained infrastructure collapsed with the cities. In their place came smaller, poorer, more fragmented communities that could barely feed themselves, let alone support professional scribes, artists, or craftsmen. The grand building projects stopped. The monumental architecture ceased. Even Egypt, which survived the invasions, has steadily weakened year by year. The Bronze Age ended not with a new invention or a superior system, but with fire and forgetting. And the sea peoples themselves simply faded. Some became Philistines in Canaan and forgot they had ever been anything else. Some joined Egyptian military units and married into local families. Some sailed west beyond our knowledge and left no trace in any record I have seen. The great migration that destroyed empires dissipated like smoke, leaving behind only fragments. A pottery style here, a weapon design there, genetic traces in coastal populations. I have spent 50 years trying to understand what happened to the world I was born into. I have read every report, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, traveled to the ruins myself, and all I know with certainty is this: Empires that seemed eternal proved fragile. The interconnected world of my youth is gone, and the people who shattered it left no explanation, only silence, and the smell of burned cities carried on Mediterranean winds, and the mystery of where they came from, why they came, and where they went when the destroying was done.